Order, order. We start with questions. Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Robert Swann.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 1, 3, 4, 7 and 10 together. I regularly meet with Northern Ireland ministers to discuss the shared challenges we face in improving public services, and the Government will do everything we can to help. Following a meeting last week with the new Finance Minister, we both expect to be in a position soon to announce progress on funding to help the transformation of public services.
Robert Swann.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Northern Ireland Executive was meant to agree its programme for government today, but apparently the meeting was cancelled at the last minute. The transformation fund that the Secretary of State refers to is £245 million that was allocated over a year ago. Hasn't been allocated, remains unspent. The transition board that was meant to be managing that fund is still interim. So with every party in Northern Ireland clamouring for transformation, the Secretary of State and his ministerial team calling for transformation of public services, will the Northern Ireland Secretary of State now intervene with the Executive and tell him to get on with it?
I hope very much that the programme for government will be agreed as soon as possible. It is the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Executive, and I look forward to reading it. There were a number of bids submitted for transformation funding. They have been carefully looked at by the interim board, and as I indicated a moment ago, I look forward, together with the Finance Minister, soon to announce the results of that work.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last December, the Royal College of Nurses in Northern Ireland revealed that there's a severe shortage of nursing staff in the north, with almost 2,000 vacancies in the sector, as well as concerns around retention. So may I ask the Secretary of State what steps his department has taken to support the Executive in providing safe levels of staffing in Northern Ireland, including tackling staffing pressures, low pay and unacceptable working conditions?
Well, I am, of course, share the concern that my honourable friend expresses about the number of vacancies. The single most important thing that the government has done has been to allocate for next year a record sum to the Northern Ireland Executive of £18.2 billion, which is an increase of £1.5 billion. The resources are there. It is for the Northern Ireland Executive to decide how they're going to use them.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Secretary of State has said about public service reform being a shared challenge. Does he agree with me that it is in the interests of patients, both in Northern Ireland and in England, to share knowledge and best practice about what works?
I agree absolutely with what my honourable friend has just said, and indeed that is what I was discussing when I met Mike Nesbitt, the Health Minister, recently, saying to him, what support and help can we give to you? But we can all learn from each other right across the United Kingdom.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder when the Secretary of State has his discussions with the Executive, he will look to the example of Wales and its social partnership model, where government, public sector workers and unions work collaboratively together in positive discussions to bring about real change and harmony in delivering public services.
Well, I would say to my honourable friend that I have not looked specifically at the social partnership model in Wales to which he refers, and I look forward to learning more about it. It sounds very interesting, and as I've already indicated, we have a lot to learn from each other.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The collaborative approach that the Minister has set out is an important step change from the previous government. Does the Minister agree with me that the task of stabilising and transforming the health service in Northern Ireland is now the priority?
Well, it certainly is, because one only has to look at the waiting list figures in Northern Ireland. 52% of those waiting for a first consultant appointment in Northern Ireland are waiting for more than a year. The figure in England is 4%. And the First Minister recently described the state of the health service in Northern Ireland as dire and diabolical. But I'm absolutely clear that ministers of the Executive understand that, and I very much support the programme that the new Health Minister is seeking to put in place to deal with that.
Sir Julian Smith.
Would he agree that the appointment of Mike Farrer, the external appointment of a new Chief Executive and Head of the Northern Ireland Health Service, is a positive movement, a good example of the Executive actually getting on with it, despite some of the comments that have been made?
I do indeed. He has great expertise and knowledge, and I'm sure that it will be used to the benefit of people in Northern Ireland, and particularly patients waiting for those appointments.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, my daughter lives in Donegal, and when her two little boys were born, she had the choice of them being born in Derry or in Sligo, either side of the border. The Republic of Ireland has introduced an initiative called Shared Island Care. This is not a united Ireland, but this works in terms of improving services. I wonder if the government would look at that, look at its success, and consider how Scotland might work in a similar way with Northern Ireland to help the services.
Well, as I understand it, there's been a long-established arrangement where people can move from one to the other to seek care, particularly Donegal, Derry, Londonderry. I think it would be slightly different in relation to Scotland for physical reasons, but once again, all opportunities that can be taken to help ensure that people get the care they need, I'm sure would be welcomed.
Colin Beeswood.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will be aware that it's been a year now since the Executive was finally re-established, and in that time the Executive have still been unable to agree a programme for government. This morning we learned that the meeting to agree it today has been moved again. Does the Secretary of State agree with me, on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland, it's time they got on with it?
Well, as I indicated a moment ago, I look forward to the Executive adopting the programme for government, and I'm aware of what happened earlier today. I'm confident that another meeting will be arranged, and I look forward to seeing it being adopted.
Shadow Secretary of State, Alex Burkhardt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Government's decision to repeal the Legacy Act will mean the reopening of many inquests and civil cases. Many of these cases will impact upon the police. Does the Secretary of State accept that this will mean a significant cost to the police service of Northern Ireland?
Well, as the honourable gentleman is aware, the legacy legislation which the previous government passed has been found to be flawed and unlawful in a number of respects, and it falls to this government to clean up the mess that the last government left. Now, I am in the process of consultation with many parties. I've already indicated to the House the proposals that I'm put forward in the remedial order and the legislation that I propose to bring to the House when parliamentary time allows. I think it is important that people are able to pursue civil cases. The ban on them of the last government has been found to be unlawful. And why should people in Northern Ireland not be entitled to an inquest?
My question, Mr. Speaker, was about the liability that the police service in Northern Ireland might be under following the Secretary of State's decision. Policing levels in Northern Ireland are at their lowest level ever. Policy Exchange, 2 weeks ago, estimated that the cost to PSNI of the repeal of the Legacy Act might well stretch to hundreds of millions of pounds. If this is the case, will the government step in to support PSNI, or is it content to see a reduction in frontline policing and national security?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman, the government has provided additional funding to the PSNI in the autumn statement through the Additional Security Fund. I've read the Policy Exchange report, and it contains a lot of speculation about numbers. The fact remains that the legislation that the government of which he was part supported hasn't worked and was flawed and is found to be unlawful. And I'm afraid the opposition is going to have to recognise at some point, and it needs to be fixed.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Dr Alping.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pharmacies in Northern Ireland are in a declared state of crisis. Pharmacists are having to dip into the savings just to stay afloat. They're cutting staff, and they're also cutting opening hours. The National Pharmacy Association, which represents 6,500 community pharmacies, has warned that its members may have to further cut opening hours, halt home deliveries and reduce local support services. And that is a warning that's amplified in Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Secretary of State What conversations has he had with the Northern Ireland Executive to safeguard access to crucial pharmacy services across rural and urban regions? And does he agree with me that an urgent impact assessment of pharmacy underfunding is required to highlight the scale of the crisis to community pharmacies, which provide vital-to-life services?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that was not an issue that figured in the discussions I had recently with the Health Minister. No doubt it will do so in the future, and I will take the matter up.
Samuel Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Money and ministerial decisions are important in getting public services delivered, but equally the backup by the civil service is important, and there is some concern about the level of expertise within the civil service in Northern Ireland. At the inquiry into RHI, the Permanent Secretary admitted that they were not able to give timely advice to ministers and hadn't given accurate advice. What can the Secretary of State do to ensure that the gap which there appears to be in expertise within the civil service, because the Northern Ireland civil service is not integrated in the UK civil service, can be filled?
Well, I would say that to the honourable gentleman that there are many civil servants I've met who are doing a very good job, and they're very committed to their work. But the Northern Ireland Civil Service is the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Executive and the ministers in the department. It is not my responsibility to deal with.
Samuel Wilson.
There are many projects which are designed to improve public services being held up at present in the courts in Northern Ireland because of procurement, planning and the decision process. The latest rouse which is now being used to hold up projects is that they do not comply with the government's net zero policies, and it will lead to an increase in CO2 emissions. One of them that is being held up is the important A5 road in the west of Northern Ireland. Does the Minister accept and agree with me that while we have statutory limits on CO2 emissions, then we're always going to be vulnerable to major infrastructure projects being held up in the courts?
Well, I don't accept that, because getting to a net zero world is really important for the future of humankind, and the government has commitments which it's very important that we fulfil. When it comes to delays within the planning system and the way in which the courts operate in Northern Ireland, once and again I would say to the right honourable gentleman that that is a matter for the Executive.
No, it's not. Michael Wheeler.
Mr. Speaker.
Stay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IRC's report highlights progress but reminds us that there is still much to do to tackle paramilitarism and the harm it causes. Following discussion with the Irish Government, it has been agreed to support a short, independent scoping exercise to assess whether there is merit in a formal process to bring about paramilitary group disbandment, as the IRC have suggested, and whether there would be public support for such a process.
Michael Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having spent lots of time with family in Northern Ireland since I was a small child, I've seen the progress made over the years and know what a difference it has made on the ground. I welcome this government's commitment to help secure this progress and to tackle the scourge of paramilitarism. Does he share my view that making further progress will require a range of measures, and that the Executive's programme on paramilitarism, criminality and organised crime is a crucial part of this?
I do indeed agree with my honourable friend. It is doing very, very good work, and of course the UK Government, together with the Executive, is funding it. And yes, I agree with him also that a wide range of approaches need to be taken, including continuing to use the full force of the law to deal with paramilitary criminality.
Jim Allister.
So, after decades of illegal paramilitary organisations taking successive governments for a ride over transition and pocketing millions of pounds on the way, the Secretary of State now wants to appoint a special envoy, a nursemaid to paramilitaries. When will this pandering come to an end? And is the Secretary of State going to accept the grotesque proposal of the IRC of moving to deprescription, whereby those organisations that murdered thousands of people would ultimately be made legal? Can he at least rule that out? On a happier note, can he join with me in welcoming today's announcement by the IFA and the Galgorm Resort of a new training facility for Northern Ireland football teams, which will be par excellence.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very happy to join in what appears to be the general consensus in welcoming the IFA's announcement, which I did discuss that proposal when I met them when I was the Shadow Secretary of State. On the substantive issue that he has raised, the fact is that 26 years later, people say the paramilitary organisation should have left the stage. They're still here, despite the progress that's been made. They're still causing harm to communities. And the proposal of the IRC, and I recognise it's not supported by everybody, the proposal from the IRC is to go and inquire, are there some who do actually want to leave the stage? And is there merit in having a process? But what I announced yesterday is not a process to do that. It is a scoping study to find out whether it is worth having one or not. And I think it's the right thing to do.
Claire Haddon.
After all these years, people are bewildered that we are still talking about transitioning paramilitary groups who have continued to recruit and to grip and poison communities and current day politics in Northern Ireland. Will the Minister commit to ensuring that we learn from all the things that haven't gone right in all the previous attempts at transition, commit to ensuring that there is no payday for former paramilitaries, that we take a serious criminal justice approach, and that there are preconditions on things like emblems and their financial assets? And does he agree with me that this makes it even more important that we get the infrastructure right on legacy of the Troubles and move towards getting us back on track as a serious rule of law society?
Secretary of State.
Well, I say to my honourable friend, there is no question, for the avoidance of doubt, there is no question of paying anybody any money to disband. There's no question of doing that at all. And as I indicated a moment ago, for all of the efforts that have been made, and there is much to learn from what has worked, the fact remains, as the IRC report makes clear, that there are many communities in Northern Ireland that continue to suffer real harm because of their activities. What is the proof of those who say they're prepared to disband? The proof will be, do they end recruitment, paramilitary-style assaults, intimidation, child criminal and sexual exploitation, and violence against women and girls, because that is what people are experiencing today in Northern Ireland.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Secretary of State as well. I want all paramilitaries off our streets for good, and I also want to see justice done for their victims. That's why I just can't quite understand why the Dublin government are closing their eyes to the 2021 Horner judgment recommending inquiries both in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. The family hearings in Omagh have brought the horror of that day to a new generation. So will the Secretary of State use his influence to call on Dublin to give the Omagh families the public inquiry they deserve and they want so much?
State.
Well, I recognise that, not least because of the commemorative hearings that have been taking place in the inquiry, all of the pain and the suffering, the horror, the tragedy of that day has been brought to life again for the families who live with it every single day of the week. I welcome the fact that the Irish Government is committed to cooperate with the Omagh inquiry. I look forward to the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. It is for the Irish Government to decide what inquiries they wish to establish in relation to events in the Republic.
Gregory Captain.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
The Secretary of State has met with suppliers, and my officials meet regularly with horticultural industry representatives. The next meeting of the Horticultural Working Group is in 2 days' time, and the Government is committed to addressing the outstanding issues on horticultural products to ensure that these can move safely within the UK.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation does remain very, very difficult. In fact, the Horticultural Trades Association said that it remains impossible for some retailers who are trying to order product from GB-based companies to consumers in Northern Ireland. Everyone can complain about this. Some of us are trying to do something about it. The government are the people who can bring pressure to bear to resolve this. What action has been taken to try and resolve this problem for consumers in Northern Ireland?
Minister.
DEFRA officials are following up specifically with those companies that are most affected, for example, seed shipping companies. Shipping seeds is allowed using phytosanitary certificates, but posting business to business is currently smoother than business to consumer. So, ways to find solutions to this are being worked out within the requirements of the Windsor Framework, and guidance should be updated shortly.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tony Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answer, but we want to know more detail around the progress that the Horticultural Working Group is making to help to resolve these issues with plants and cut flowers from the movements of GB to NI under the Windsor Framework. So can she please update it as a matter of urgency?
Minister.
I can provide more updates, but for example, on the banned plants, they're being worked through species by species. There were 11 in 2023, 10 in 2024, and we're working through each one of those. So the working group is taking each of the issues on a case-by-case basis and working through each of those issues as it arises.
Alex Easton.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask the Minister about veterinary medical supplies for Northern Ireland with the grace period about to run out within the next year? What are the plans to make sure that Northern Ireland doesn't run out of veterinary medicines?
Minister.
We're working actively to narrow the range of products where there's a problem, but working with each one of those as well. So this is an active consideration, knowing that, as the member points out, the deadline is approaching.
Lee Ingham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Windsor Framework was a distinct improvement on the old Northern Ireland Protocol. But does the Minister agree with me that to ensure the smoothest possible movement of agri-food products across the Irish Sea, it's vital we secure an SPS agreement with the EU?
I agree with my right honourable friend that the Windsor Framework is a big improvement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and we are committed to implementing the Windsor Framework at the same time as seeking to negotiate an SPS agreement that would provide further improvements to the movement of agri-food products. And we must pave the way to this by resetting our relationship with the EU and implementing the Windsor Framework in good faith.
Sir Desmond Swig.
Number 6, sir.
Thursday.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 6 and 11 together. The approach taken by the previous government to legacy was wrong. It caused immense pain to victims and survivors, and in many respects has been found to be unlawful. In December, I laid a proposal for a draft remedial order to address the human rights deficiencies in the Act identified by the courts, and when parliamentary time allows, I will introduce primary legislation to reinstate legacy inquests halted by the Act and to reform and strengthen the ICRIR.
Sir Desmond.
Why did he abandon the appeal in Dillon and Oars?
Great question. Because clauses 46 and 47 were found to be unlawful, and as he will be aware, the case that gave rise to the attempt to deal with the problem by those clauses have now been found to be unlawful, came from a Supreme Court judgment in 2020. And for two and a bit years, the previous government was unable to find a solution.
Gagan Mahendra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the Northern Ireland Secretary's response just there, why is this Labour government continue to undermine the tough action taken by the Conservative government on individuals who have acted against our democracy and society, such as Gerry Adams, by considering repealing the Legacy Act, giving him and others the possibility of a six-figure payout?
Well, as I've indicated to the House at the last Northern Ireland oral questions, nobody wants to see that happen. We are currently working to find a lawful way of dealing with the problems that were created by the way in which the original interim custody orders were signed in 1972 and I think 1973, which the Supreme Court in 2020 found, where they were not signed and considered by the Secretary of State, were not lawful.
Louise Haig.
In 2019, Boris Johnson commissioned the Shawcross report into Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism. US citizens have received compensation from the Libyan government for attacks on British soil, but UK citizens never have. Will the Secretary of State work with the FCDO to ensure that the Shawcross report is published?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. and the whole House will have profound sympathy for all the victims of Gaddafi-sponsored IRA terrorism and all the victims of the Troubles. The Shawcross report was commissioned by the previous government as an internal report, and decisions on the report and its future are currently under review by the FCDO.
Go through, yes. Shadow Minister Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People right across the United Kingdom will be disgusted if former terrorists like Gerry Adams get compensation from the taxpayer because of Labour's decision to repeal the Legacy Act without putting something in its place. Will the Secretary of State finally commit to legislating immediately to prevent this from happening?
Well, I refer the honourable gentleman to the answer I gave a moment ago on that issue.
Right.